Officer Daniels had always carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His uniform, crisp and unwrinkled, was a second skin, one that gave him power, a power he wielded without question. To the world, he was a decorated officer, a man committed to upholding the law. But to the people in the neighborhoods he patrolled, he was a predator. He was not there to serve and protect, he was there to dominate, to remind them of their place. For years, Daniels had operated without consequence. His methods were not questioned, his actions not scrutinized. When he pulled over a young black man without cause, no one challenged him. When he slammed a suspect against the hood of his cruiser for resisting, his fellow officers looked away. The bruises, the broken bones, the fabricated reports, they all blurred into a system that protected men like him. He knew how to manipulate the narrative, how to frame his victims as threats, how to make his violence seem justified. And because of that, he had never been afraid. That night, however, was different. It started like any other. A routine patrol. A dark street illuminated by flickering streetlights. Then he saw them, two young black men standing near a corner store, talking in hushed voices. Daniels narrowed his eyes. Suspicious. He slowed his cruiser, watching them. One of the men laughed, shaking his head, unaware of the danger approaching. Daniels stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Hands where I can see them. His voice was sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. The two men exchanged glances. One of them, a taller man with dreadlocks, raised his hands. We ain't doing nothing, officer. Daniel's grip tightened around his baton. Did I ask you to talk? He stepped closer, towering over them. The shorter man, his face tense with barely contained frustration, spoke up. Man, we're just talking. You got no reason to. That was all it took. In one swift motion, Daniels grabbed him by the collar, yanking him forward. You think you can mouth off to me? His voice was low, filled with quiet menace. He could feel the man's body tense, his breath quickening. Fear. He thrived on that fear. Let go of me, man. The younger man struggled, his voice rising. Daniels smirked. Oh, now you're resisting? He shoved him hard against the hood of his cruiser. The metal was cold against the man's cheek as he winced in pain. The taller man stepped forward. Come on, man, this ain't right. Daniels turned sharply. Step back. His hand instinctively hovered over his holster. The message was clear, one wrong move, and this could end differently. The man hesitated, his hands still raised, his chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. Daniels could see the anger in his eyes, the frustration of years of oppression simmering just beneath the surface. But he didn't move. He knew better. They all did. Daniels leaned in close to the man pinned against the car. You're lucky, he muttered. Because I could ruin your life tonight. He released him with a shove, watching as he stumbled, his face a mix of rage and humiliation. Get out of here, Daniels spat. Before I change my mind. The two men didn't argue. They knew the rules of this game, his game. Slowly, they backed away, their bodies rigid with anger and fear. Daniels watched them go, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Another night, another lesson taught. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that someone had been watching. From the shadows, a woman stepped forward, a phone in her hand, her expression unreadable. She had recorded everything. Every word. Every action. Every abuse of power. And this time, Daniels wouldn't be the one controlling the story. By morning, the video had gone viral. Social media exploded with outrage. News stations picked up the footage, playing it on repeat. Calls for his arrest echoed across the city. Daniels sat in his squad car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues, warning him, others from unknown numbers, filled with threats. His name, once a symbol of unchecked authority, was now synonymous with brutality. For the first time in his career, Daniels felt a flicker of something foreign. It wasn't anger. It wasn't power. It was fear. And this time, it was his own. The courtroom was suffocating with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled, from anxious spectators to seasoned journalists poised with pens scratching against notepads. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the solemn faces. Some whispered in hushed tones, while others sat in stiff silence, waiting for what would come next. At the defendant's table, Officer Daniels sat rigidly, his posture tense, his jaw locked so tightly it seemed he might grind his teeth into dust. His fingers drummed against the table, a nervous tick that betrayed the confidence he usually carried with his badge. Sweat lined his temples, but he didn't lift a hand to wipe it away. His entire career had been built on control, on authority, and yet, sitting in that chair, under the scrutiny of the judge, the jury, and the watchful eyes of the public, he had never felt so powerless. Across from him, Marcus Hayes sat with his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable but his presence commanding. He wasn't a victim in this moment, he was something stronger. His hands rested on his lap, fingers occasionally clenching as he braced himself for what was to come. The memories of that night were seared into his mind, the fear, the pain, the helplessness, but today, he wasn't the one on trial. "All rise," the bailiff's voice rang out, sharp and unwavering. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and Judge Carter strode in, his robe billowing slightly as he took his seat. The entire courtroom stood, then sat in unison, the wooden benches groaning under the shifting weight. The only sound that followed was the shuffling of papers, the clearing of a throat, and then, silence. A waiting silence. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stood slowly, deliberately, as she approached the jury. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing in the vast chamber. She didn't speak immediately, instead, she let the weight of the moment settle, let the tension tighten its grip on the room. Then, she nodded once. The large screen beside her flickered to life. The grainy cell phone footage began to play. A dimly lit street. A lone man walking. A patrol car pulling up beside him. A voice, authoritative and sharp, "Stop right there." The video continued. Officer Daniels stepping out, his hand already resting on his holster. Marcus, confused, lifting his hands slightly in question, not in resistance. Then the shove. Hard, unrelenting. Marcus stumbling back, his voice cracking, "I didn't do anything." Another shove. The cold metal of the police car against his chest. The audience collectively inhaled. Some turned away. Others leaned in, eyes locked on the screen. Then came the worst part. The baton. The sickening crack of impact against ribs. The groan of pain that followed. "Stay down!" Daniel's voice roared through the speakers. The courtroom was deathly silent. Even the sound of breathing seemed absent. Daniel shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening into fists. He felt the stares bore into him, judgmental, condemning. He had worn the badge for years, had stood in court before, but never like this. Never with the weight of his own actions shackling him down. The prosecutor let the silence linger before turning back to the jury. "This," she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury, "is not law enforcement. This is abuse." The statement hung in the air like a blade. Witnesses were called. The woman who had filmed the video took the stand first. Her voice wavered slightly at first, but she steadied herself. "I couldn't just walk away," she said. "I knew what was happening. I knew it wasn't right. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't a threat." She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting in her lap. But the officer, he just kept going. Then came the forensic expert. Cold facts. The extent of Marcus' injuries. Broken ribs. Bruises lining his back. The sheer force that had been used. And then, Marcus himself. He walked to the stand with measured steps, his head held high despite the past that threatened to pull him down. He inhaled deeply. Exhaled. Then, he spoke. "I was just walking home," he said, his voice steady, though an unmistakable flicker of emotion cracked through. "I wasn't drunk. I wasn't causing trouble. I was just living. And then suddenly, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a suspect. A threat. He paused, his hands gripping the edges of the stand. I remember the fear. The way he looked at me, like I didn't matter. His throat bobbed with a hard swallow. I thought I was going to die that night. A few murmurs rippled through the audience, but the judge held up a hand, silencing them. Then came the final blow. This isn't just one mistake, the prosecutor said, lifting a thick stack of papers, dropping them onto the table with an unmistakable thud. Officer Daniels has a history of excessive force complaints. Cases that were dismissed. Reports that were altered. Time after time, he was allowed to walk away without consequences. The room reacted as if struck by a physical force. Gasps. A sharp intake of breath. Daniels turned to his lawyer, but the man's face was grim. He knew. Everyone knew. Judge Carter leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. His face remained unreadable, but the weight of his voice was undeniable. Officer Daniels, he said, his tone steady but edged with something final, the badge you wore was meant to protect and serve, not to instill fear, not to harm. The court has reviewed the evidence, and the conclusion is clear. Today, the power you once abused is no longer yours. Daniels stiffened, his jaw clenching, but there was no fight left in him. His hands, which had once wielded authority so easily, now lay motionless in his lap. The gavel struck. The shift was immediate. A wave of relief washed over the room. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into quiet nods of acknowledgement. Justice had been served, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been too afraid to speak, too powerless to fight. Daniels, once untouchable, now sat as just another man, stripped of the power he had taken for granted. Renee's footsteps echoed sharply in the hallway, the rhythmic click of her heels a steady metronome that seemed to mark the passage of time, amplifying the intensity of the moment. Her hand gripped the folder tightly, the evidence within it a quiet reminder of everything she had worked for and the path she was now walking. Her heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of calm resolve. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay focused, to keep emotions at bay when it mattered most. Today, however, there was an edge of something raw beneath her composed exterior, a mixture of anger, disappointment, and determination that pushed her forward. She could hear Daniels before she saw him, his voice booming down the hall in its usual condescending tone. His laughter, shallow and dismissive, sent a shiver of revulsion through her. He was standing there at the end of the hallway, his back straight, his shoulders broad as if he were still trying to project an aura of dominance. But Renee knew better. This wasn't the same man who had controlled the department for years. His power was crumbling, and the fear that had been bubbling beneath the surface since the courtroom confrontation was now leaking into his every movement. When she reached him, she stopped just a few feet away, allowing the silence to stretch between them. Daniels looked at her with a mixture of defiance and disdain, as if he were a lion trying to assert his strength before a predator he didn't yet understand. He sneered, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You're really going to do this, Carter? You think you can bring me down with your little paperwork and your feigned righteousness?" The words stung, but Renee didn't flinch. The years of being underestimated, of being dismissed as just another officer trying to prove herself, had prepared her for this. She had faced men like him before, arrogant, entitled, believing their badges gave them carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. But this time, Daniels had crossed a line, and today was the day he would pay for it. Her fingers tightened around the folder, the edges digging into her palm. "This isn't about paperwork, Daniels," she said, her voice steady but with an underlying current of steel. "This is about accountability. It's about justice. You've abused your power for too long, and I'm done watching you get away with it." Daniels' expression flickered, his confident exterior cracking for just a moment. He took a small step back, his shoulders shifting slightly as though the weight of her words had hit him harder than he expected. But it didn't last. The arrogance returned, and he straightened, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think you're the first person to try and take me down? I've had people like you come at me before. They never last." His voice was thick with scorn, but there was an unmistakable tremor beneath it. Renee held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She had heard it all before, the threats, the mockery, the attempts to belittle her efforts. But she wasn't intimidated anymore. She had fought too hard, bled too much to let a man like Daniels dictate the outcome. This wasn't just about one case, it was about every officer, every person who had been crushed under the weight of corruption in the department. This was for them. "No, Daniels," she said softly, but with undeniable authority. "You're wrong. I'm not the first. But I'll be the last." She reached into her bag, pulling out the thick folder that was now the crux of everything she had been working toward. She held it out to him, watching as his eyes darted toward it with the briefest flicker of concern before he masked it again with a smirk. "What's this, Carter?" he sneered. "Another set of complaints? Another round of useless paperwork?" But Renee didn't answer him right away. Instead, she stood there, letting the silence weigh heavily in the space between them. She let him stew in the discomfort of the moment, watching him squirm as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, quiet threat that felt like the calm before a storm. "This isn't useless paperwork, Daniels. This is the beginning of the end for you. I've requested a full review of every case you've ever been involved in. Every complaint, every report, every single incident of misconduct you've been a part of will be investigated. And this time, there will be no one to cover it up for you." Daniel's face faltered for the briefest of moments. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Renee saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. It was a fleeting thing, gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, but it was enough. He had always been in control, always shielded by his connections and his ability to manipulate the system. But now, that control was slipping, and he knew it. He laughed, but it was hollow, lacking the strength it had once had. "You think this will make a difference?" he scoffed. "You're just one person. What can you possibly do?" Renee stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity. "I can do more than you think," she said quietly. "And I will. You may have hidden behind your badge for years, Daniels, but you can't hide anymore." She turned on her heel, walking away without looking back. The air in the hallway seemed to grow heavier, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Behind her, she could hear Daniel's footsteps follow for a brief second, before the sound faded away. She knew he wasn't following her to stop her. He was running from the truth she was bringing with her, just as he had been running from it his entire career. But not anymore. The change had begun. Renee Carter's journey into law enforcement was not born of ambition alone but shaped by a deep, personal tragedy. Raised in a working-class family where hard work and honesty were valued above all else, Renee witnessed firsthand the harsh realities of life. Her father, a dedicated police officer, was the embodiment of justice in her eyes. But that image was shattered when he was wrongfully accused of a crime he did not commit. The accusations were not just false, they were strategically fabricated, driven by political agendas and the power of those who sought to silence him. Despite overwhelming evidence of his innocence, her father's career was destroyed, and his reputation irreparably tarnished. Renee watched as the justice system failed the one man who had dedicated his life to upholding it, and she could do nothing but feel helpless. That helplessness grew into a burning resolve. She swore silently that, one day, she would return to the force, not just to fight for justice, but to dismantle the system that had betrayed her father and so many others like him. That vow was the driving force behind her decision to pursue a career in law enforcement, but it was also the anchor that weighed her down. The road was never easy. Despite her academic excellence and early promise, she encountered skepticism at every turn. As a young, determined woman in a male-dominated field, her every move was scrutinized, often dismissed. Colleagues saw her as naive, too eager to believe in the sanctity of the law. There were moments when she began to doubt her own purpose. The sheer exhaustion of fighting against the system she had once hoped to reform was beginning to chip away at her idealism. The whispers in the hallways of the department, the disapproving glares from her superiors, the closed doors that kept her from progressing, it was all enough to make her question if she had what it took to make a real difference. But even in her darkest moments, the memory of her father's downfall kept her grounded. His unwavering belief in justice, his ultimate betrayal by the very institution he served, fueled her. She couldn't afford to fail. She wouldn't. Her work began to speak for itself. Renee developed a reputation as a meticulous investigator, someone who could spot inconsistencies others overlooked, someone who would relentlessly dig until the truth surfaced. She earned respect in her department, not through accolades or favors, but through sheer determination and an unyielding desire to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. Yet, with every case she unraveled, the stakes grew higher. Renee's quiet resolve slowly transformed into a quiet defiance, and that defiance began to draw the attention of more powerful figures, including those in the very department she had once admired. When the media first took notice of her work, Renee was hesitant. At first, it felt like validation. The world was paying attention to her efforts to uncover the corruption within her own department, and she was finally being seen. The headlines hailed her as a hero, someone willing to challenge the establishment for the greater good. Her mother, who had always been supportive but wary of the dangers Renee's career brought, took some comfort in seeing her daughter recognized for her hard work. But for Renee, the attention was more complicated. What had started as a celebration of her achievements began to feel like a trap. The cameras, the constant interviews, the invasive questions, they all had a price. As the public's attention on her grew, so did the pressure. Every move she made, every decision she took, was scrutinized and dissected. What had once felt empowering, the chance to speak her truth and expose the system's flaws, soon began to feel suffocating. She was no longer just Renee Carter, the dedicated officer. She was the symbol of something larger, something that she wasn't sure she had the strength to carry. The weight of public attention began to take its toll. Renee found herself caught in a storm of media frenzy. News outlets praised her one moment and then questioned her motives the next. She saw herself portrayed not as a woman of integrity, but as a figure to be torn apart, an object of scrutiny and judgment. The same reporters who once lauded her for her bravery were now hounding her with relentless questions about her personal life. They questioned her every choice, every moment of hesitation. Was she too naive? Was she being manipulated? Did she really understand the power she was up against? The noise was deafening, and the pressure was almost unbearable. There were nights when Renee lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She wasn't used to this feeling of being watched every second, of having every action analyzed for the smallest mistake. And then, as if to intensify the already unbearable situation, the threats began. Anonymous messages, eerie phone calls in the middle of the night, and the unsettling feeling of being followed in public. The department's internal politics were far more treacherous than she had ever imagined. Each new case she uncovered, particularly the more high-profile ones involving officers like Daniels, seemed to push her closer to the edge. Some of her colleagues warned her, some out of genuine concern, others out of self-preservation. They advised her to back down, to stop digging where she wasn't wanted, to let the powerful figures within the department remain untouched. But Renee couldn't. Every time someone asked her to stop, every time the media distorted her words, every time a threat came her way, it only fueled her resolve. She had seen firsthand how easy it was for the corrupt to thrive when no one challenged them. She had seen how one false accusation could destroy a life, how one overlooked injustice could pave the way for countless others. Her father's downfall had taught her that the system was broken, and she wasn't about to let it remain broken on her watch. Despite the increasing danger, Renee became more determined. She found new allies in the media, recognizing that they could amplify her message in ways she couldn't on her own. Instead of hiding from the spotlight, she began to use it to her advantage. Each interview, each press conference, became another opportunity to push her agenda. She was no longer just uncovering corruption, she was challenging an entire system, one that had allowed men like Officer Daniels to operate with impunity for far too long. But still, the pressure mounted. The constant media attention began to erode her sense of self. She struggled to maintain her composure in the face of mounting stress, and sometimes, when she stood in front of the cameras, she felt a flicker of doubt. Was this the woman she had set out to be? The woman her father would have been proud of? Or had she become just another pawn in a game much larger than herself? Despite the overwhelming doubts and the mounting pressure, Renee stood firm. She had come too far to turn back now. Every sleepless night, every tear shed in the quiet solitude of her apartment, only made her more determined. She had not come this far to back down, not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. The media's spotlight, though painful, became her weapon. She had learned to wield it, to turn it back on the corrupt system that sought to destroy her. The weight of her father's legacy hung heavy on her shoulders, but it also pushed her forward. He had been destroyed by the system, but she would not let that happen to her. No matter the cost, no matter how much she had to endure, Renee Carter would fight until the end. Her resolve was unshakable now. She had been forged in the flames of doubt, pressure, and betrayal, and now, nothing could break her. Renee Carter sat at her desk, the weight of the evidence spread before her like a mountain she could no longer ignore. Each report, each piece of video footage, each discrepancy she uncovered felt like a deeper wound in the system she had once believed in. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages, but her mind was sharp, focused. She had been working on this case for weeks, slowly piecing together the truth about Officer Daniels and his decades-long abuse of power. Every new discovery made her stomach churn, but it also steeled her resolve. There was no going back now. Her breath caught in her throat as she examined the footage one last time. The video wasn't clear, grainy, distorted, but it was enough. She had watched it over and over, her mind refusing to let go of what it revealed. The image of Daniels, in full uniform, emerging from an alley, his steps measured and purposeful, made her stomach turn. What the camera couldn't capture was the scene behind him, the unconscious body of a man, bruised and bloodied. The evidence was undeniable. Daniels had left a trail of victims, but this time, he had left something else behind, proof of his guilt. But as much as she knew the truth, her heart hammered with the weight of what this meant. Renee had always prided herself on her integrity, on her ability to stand up for what was right. But the longer she worked on this case, the more she felt the crushing weight of her isolation. She wasn't just up against Daniels, she was up against an entire system that had turned a blind eye to his crimes for years. The officers who had covered for him, the higher-ups who had turned a blind eye, every step she took felt like a step further into a dangerous unknown. She had always trusted the department, believed in its mission. But as each layer of the truth was revealed, her faith began to fracture. How could she have been so blind? How could everyone have let this happen? There were nights when she couldn't sleep, when her thoughts spiraled out of control. What would happen if Daniels found out what she was doing? What if the entire department turned against her? The whispers had already started. The cold shoulders, the side-eye glances. It was as though the very people she had once called colleagues had already made their choice, to protect Daniels, to protect the system, rather than the truth. Every day, Renee felt the weight of their unspoken disapproval, the isolation growing heavier. She wasn't naive enough to think that bringing down someone like Daniels wouldn't come with consequences. The question was she strong enough to face them? Her resolve was tested time and time again. Every new discovery sent a shiver down her spine, but each time she hesitated, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. The victims. The people Daniels had destroyed, the lives he had ruined. This wasn't just about exposing one bad cop. This was about justice for the countless people who had been silenced, whose pain had been overlooked. And it was about her own need for redemption, for retribution, for the truth. But there was a part of her that was terrified of what Daniels might do if he found out. She had seen the way he manipulated situations, how he controlled the narrative, how he could twist the truth to fit his needs. He had done it for years. And Renee feared that she might be his next target. Yet, as much as fear gnawed at her, another feeling began to grow inside her. A sense of purpose, a burning need to right the wrongs that had been done. She couldn't let fear stop her now. The tipping point came late one evening when an anonymous tip came through. A shaky voice on the other end of the line, desperate and fearful, shared a video that would change everything. It was a grainy surveillance clip, showing Daniels in an alley, walking away from a scene where a man lay unconscious. The camera was far enough to obscure most of the details, but there was no mistaking the officer in the uniform. It was Daniels. Renee's heart skipped a beat as she watched the footage over and over, each time feeling the weight of what she was seeing. This was it, the undeniable evidence she had been waiting for. But as she sat back in her chair, the weight of the decision hit her hard. This was no longer about uncovering the truth, it was about exposing herself to a system that could very well destroy her. If she released this footage, she would become the enemy. She would become the whistleblower, the one who had dared to challenge the power structure. The fear, the doubt, the anxiety, all rushed back to her in a tidal wave. She could feel the sweat on her palms, the thudding of her heart in her chest. What if Daniels retaliated? What if the department turned on her? But then, as the fear tightened around her chest, something else broke through, a sense of clarity. She couldn't turn back. She couldn't live with herself if she did. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. She was no longer just a witness to corruption, she was the one who would end it. The people who had been hurt, the lives that had been ruined, they needed justice. She couldn't ignore that. Renee gathered the evidence with a steady hand, her thoughts a whirlwind as she prepared to present it to her superiors. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew they would fight her, try to discredit her. But she couldn't keep running from the truth. Her entire career had led to this moment, and she had no choice but to follow through, no matter how terrifying the consequences seemed. When she finally stood before her superiors, the weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. Her stomach churned, her hands shaking, but her voice was firm. She laid out everything, the footage, the reports, the timeline, and watched as their faces shifted from indifference to shock, to disbelief, to something darker. She knew they would try to protect Daniels, try to cover this up. But Renee was resolute. She had come this far, and she wouldn't back down now. The fear inside her slowly began to fade, replaced by something fiercer, something stronger. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for herself, for the truth, and for the people who had been left in the wake of Daniel's abuse of power. As her superiors processed the evidence, Renee felt the first spark of relief. It wasn't over, not yet, but she had taken the first step toward making things right. She wasn't going to let fear control her anymore. The storm was coming, and she would face it head-on. No matter the cost. Renee sat at her desk, the faint hum of the office lights echoing in the otherwise silent room. The darkness of the evening outside seemed to seep into the corners of her mind as she stared at the pile of documents in front of her. She had been at this for hours, and yet the weight of what she was uncovering still hadn't fully hit her. She knew she had to keep going, had to push through the exhaustion and the overwhelming sense of dread building inside her. But with every page she turned, every piece of evidence she uncovered, the feeling that this was something bigger than she could handle began to take root. Her fingers lingered on a photograph, the glossy image slightly smudged from being handled so many times. The picture was grainy, the angles awkward, but it was enough to make her stomach tighten. There was no mistaking the scene. Officer Daniels, a man she had worked alongside for years, was in the frame. His uniform was familiar, almost comforting in its sterility, but it was the man's eyes that struck her. They were cold, devoid of any empathy, as he loomed over a terrified figure in the alleyway. The young man in the photo had his hands raised, clearly pleading for mercy, but there was no mercy to be found. Renee's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a bad decision or a mistake made in the heat of the moment. This was intentional, calculated. Daniels had abused his power, had taken the trust the public placed in him and twisted it into something monstrous. Renee felt a sickening wave of realization wash over her. She had always believed that the system worked, that people like Daniels, who wore the badge and took the oath, were bound by a sense of duty to protect, not harm. But now, she was looking at the evidence of the very opposite. She quickly flipped through the other reports, each one more damning than the last. The testimonies from victims, who had been too scared to speak up for so long, filled her with a growing anger. She could feel her jaw tighten as she read their accounts, stories of coercion, intimidation, and violence. They were desperate pleas for justice, and she had the power to make sure they were heard. But as the anger surged within her, so did the fear. This was bigger than she had anticipated. Officer Daniels wasn't just a rogue cop who had made some bad decisions. He was part of a system that had protected him, that had allowed his abuse to go unchecked for far too long. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just about to expose one bad cop, she was about to challenge the very institution that had failed to stop him, the institution that had kept his victims in the shadows. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the pages, but her resolve was hardening with every new piece of evidence she uncovered. Her heart pounded as she looked at the final report. The words jumped off the page, clear and unmistakable. Officer Daniels had been implicated in multiple incidents, and the pattern was undeniable. He had used his position, his badge, to manipulate and control, to hurt those who had no power to defend themselves. The system had allowed this to happen, had looked the other way for far too long. And now, it was up to her to bring it to light. But as she sat there, staring at the files in front of her, the weight of what she was about to do began to settle heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just exposing one man's corruption, she was about to take on the system that had enabled him. She could feel the pressure building, the mounting fear that this could cost her everything. The truth was heavy, and the consequences of revealing it were unknown. She stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a loud screech, her body moving almost instinctively. Her mind was racing, thoughts colliding, pushing her to act, but also paralyzing her with the gravity of what she was about to do. Her pulse quickened, and she paced around the small office, trying to organize her thoughts. How could she possibly take this to her superiors? How could she trust anyone in the system that had failed so many times before? She had always believed in justice, in doing what was right, but now, as she looked at the evidence, it felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of the very institution she had worked so hard to be a part of. But this was bigger than her. This was about the victims who had been ignored, who had been silenced by fear and corruption. Her fists clenched as she stood by the window, staring out at the darkened city. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her chest, threatening to crush her under its magnitude. What would happen if she exposed Daniels? What would happen if she went public with this? There were so many questions, so many uncertainties. But one thing was clear, the victims couldn't wait any longer. She had the power to make their voices heard, to bring the truth to light, and no matter the cost, she had to do it. The anger inside her burned like a fire, hot and unrelenting. Daniels had to be stopped. The system had to be held accountable. And if she was the one to do it, then so be it. Her breath steadied as she walked back to her desk, the decision made. She would send the files to her superior, outline everything with precision, and demand that something be done. No more hesitation, no more second-guessing. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would define everything she had worked for. The truth was out there, staring her in the face, and she was the only one who could make sure it was heard. With a steady hand, she typed the email, outlining the evidence, the timeline, and the undeniable truth. She hit send, and as the email was dispatched into the void, she exhaled deeply. There was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and Renee was ready to face whatever came next. Renee sat alone in her office, the sterile white walls seeming to close in around her as she read the email again, unable to fully comprehend its contents. The words were real, Officer Daniels has been suspended pending investigation *, but they felt like they belonged to someone else's story. She'd known this moment was coming, had even braced herself for it, but now that it was here, a strange numbness settled over her. Her heart thudded heavily in her chest, not from a sense of relief or accomplishment, but from the weight of what she had set in motion. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled through the message once more, the shock still reverberating in her mind. She had done it. She had finally acted against Daniels, the man who had seemed untouchable for so long. And yet, as she sat there, staring at the screen, she felt nothing like a hero. In fact, she didn't even feel like herself anymore. The pressure of the decision, the realization that her actions had irrevocably changed the course of her life, pressed down on her shoulders like a suffocating weight. The walls of the department had once been a place of familiarity, of purpose. But now they felt foreign, as if she were an outsider in the very system she had spent her career supporting. As she sank deeper into her thoughts, Renee's gaze flicked to the clock on her desk. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dragging on painfully. The department had been in chaos since the news broke. There was an energy, a tension, coursing through the precinct, palpable in the hushed voices, in the side-eyed glances exchanged between colleagues. They hadn't expected this. No one had. Not Daniels, not the officers who had worked alongside him, not even Renee herself. She hadn't expected the aftermath to feel so heavy. The echoes of judgment reverberated around her, as if every move she made was being scrutinized under a microscope. And then there was the guilt. She couldn't deny it, even if she tried. Guilt for exposing Daniels, yes, but also for what came with that exposure. She had brought down a man, a colleague, someone who had shared their victories and defeats, their frustrations and triumphs. Had she ruined his life? Was it right to destroy everything he had worked for? The thoughts swirled in her mind, clashing with her conviction, leaving her adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. The door creaked open, snapping Renee out of her spiraling thoughts. She straightened in her chair as Captain Harris stepped into her office. His expression was unreadable, his eyes steely and distant, but there was something else, a weariness, perhaps. He had been in the department long enough to see the fall of other officers, but this? This was different. Daniels had been one of their own. Renee had known that confronting him would be a difficult and lonely journey, but now that the deed was done, she felt more isolated than ever. "Renee," Captain Harris said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. It wasn't a question, just the acknowledgement of a shared reality between them. His gaze flicked to the computer screen, and then back to her, as though he were trying to read her in this moment of silence. She had expected the conversation. She had steeled herself for it. But now, with Harris standing before her, the pressure of the situation seemed to amplify tenfold. For a long beat, neither of them spoke. The tension was so thick it felt suffocating. Renee opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She had planned what she would say, had rehearsed it in her mind. She had wanted to explain, to justify her actions, but now the words felt hollow. How could she explain what had driven her to expose Daniels when she herself was struggling to understand it? "Renee," Harris said again, his voice quieter this time. "You knew this wasn't going to be easy. Daniels, he was one of us. We all worked with him. You've made a choice that's going to have consequences, not just for him, but for all of us." Her chest tightened at his words. She had known the fallout would be significant, but hearing it from him, the captain, the man who had always been a symbol of authority, stability, felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't want to hear the words, didn't want to face the consequences of her decision. But she couldn't escape them. They were inescapable now. "I know," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I didn't want this. I didn't want to destroy him, but he had to be stopped. People were getting hurt." Harris looked at her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though searching for something in her expression. Renee couldn't hold his gaze. She felt too vulnerable, too exposed. She had hoped that the clarity of her actions would have been enough to shield her from the aftermath, but now, sitting across from the captain, she realized that nothing was that simple. "I understand that," Harris replied slowly. "But you need to understand something else, Renee. This isn't just about Daniels anymore. The investigation that follows, it's going to dig deep. It's not just going to be his actions under scrutiny. It's going to be all of us. Your decision has opened a door that can't be closed, and once it's open, there's no telling what might come out." Renee's stomach twisted painfully at his words. She had anticipated an investigation, of course. But she hadn't fully grasped the scope of it. She hadn't realized just how much was at stake now that the truth had come to light. The department, the very institution she had once believed in, was now being scrutinized. And she, the one who had made the call, was now in the spotlight as well. Her hands clenched into fists on the desk, and she fought to keep her composure, to remain resolute. "You're not just exposing Daniels," Harris continued. "You're exposing everything. The system. The way we operate. People are going to question everything now. And that means you're going to be under the microscope, too. Everyone will be watching you." His words hung in the air like a cloud of uncertainty, and Renee felt a chill run down her spine. She had never expected the fallout to feel like this. She had never expected to become the subject of scrutiny, the one everyone would watch. The guilt, the fear, it was all crashing down on her now, in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. "I'm ready," she said finally, though the words felt brittle, fragile. She wasn't sure she was ready, but she had no choice. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. "I did what I had to do." Harris studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded, his voice softening just a fraction. "Just remember, Renee," he said, his tone heavy with the weight of experience, "this is only the beginning. There's a long road ahead, and it's not going to be easy. You may find yourself walking it alone. The finality of his words hit her like a wave, and for the first time, Renee felt the full force of her decision. The road ahead was uncertain, and the path would be fraught with challenges, both personal and professional. But in that moment, amidst the fear and the doubt, one thing was clear: she had done what she believed was right. And she would face whatever came next with the same resolve that had brought her here. Renee sat frozen at her desk, her fingers trembling as she stared at the phone screen. The message in front of her felt like a punch to the gut, the words searing through her thoughts in a way that made everything else around her blur. Officer Daniels has fled the jurisdiction and is currently evading arrest. The room, which moments before had felt full of energy and purpose, now seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in as the weight of the words settled over her. It was like a bad dream, one she could neither escape nor wake up from. The man she had trusted, worked alongside for years, was now a fugitive, and it felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. For a moment, she just stared at the message, as if willing it to change, as if hoping it was some sort of mistake, a cruel prank. But no matter how long she stared, the message didn't change. It was true. Daniels, her colleague, her partner in investigations, was on the run, and everything she thought she knew was falling apart. The realization was slow to sink in, but when it did, it hit her with a wave of shock that left her breathless. She could feel the air growing heavy around her, as though the entire office had been filled with an invisible tension, like every person in the room knew what was happening and was too afraid to say it out loud. How had it come to this? She had worked closely with Daniels for years, watched him solve case after case with precision and professionalism. He had always seemed like a man driven by justice, someone who would never cross the line, someone who would protect the law. But now, it was clear that she had been wrong. Daniels wasn't just someone who believed in justice, he had become the very thing they fought against. The thought of it made her stomach churn. She felt betrayed, not just by him, but by her own inability to see through the carefully constructed facade he had built around himself. How had he managed to deceive everyone for so long? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Had there been signs? She thought back to their recent cases, their conversations. Daniels had seemed distant lately, but hadn't he always been a bit reserved? She had dismissed the little things, the odd behavior, the moments of tension, the way he would sometimes withdraw into himself after a tough day. But now, looking back, it was clear that something had been off. She had been too focused on her work, too consumed by the task at hand, to notice the growing darkness in him. Renee pushed herself away from the desk, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, the noise a jarring reminder of how everything around her had suddenly shifted. She stood up and walked to the window, needing to do something, needing to move. The view outside, usually something that brought her a sense of calm, now seemed distant, detached, as though the world had somehow continued without her. Was this it, she thought? Had she been blind to the truth all along? The question lingered in her mind, each time it came more painful than the last. The anger hit her then, sharp and unforgiving. She had given everything to this job, to the pursuit of justice. She had trusted Daniels, relied on him, even confided in him at times. And now, he had betrayed not just her, but the entire department. How could he do this? How could he run, leaving everyone else to clean up the mess he had created? The anger boiled inside her, fueling her need to act, to do something, anything, to fix this. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she struggled to keep her composure. The anger wasn't just aimed at Daniels, it was at herself too. How had she not seen this coming? But beneath the anger, there was something else. Fear. The kind of deep, gut-wrenching fear that made her feel small and vulnerable. Daniels wasn't just a colleague anymore, he was a fugitive, someone who could be anywhere, someone who could turn violent if cornered. The uncertainty of it all made her stomach tighten. He knew them. He knew how they worked, how they thought, and that made him even more dangerous. The idea of him being out there, hiding in plain sight, made her heart race. What if he had already anticipated every move they would make? What if he had planned this escape down to the smallest detail? What if he came after them? She tried to focus, to push the fear aside, but it lingered, an unshakable presence that clouded her every thought. She needed to act, needed to help find him before he disappeared completely, but the reality of the situation seemed overwhelming. She had always prided herself on being able to handle any crisis, but this was different. This wasn't just a case to solve, it was personal. And it made her feel powerless. The door to her office creaked open, snapping her out of her thoughts. Captain Harris stepped inside, his face drawn, his expression a mirror of her own shock. The room had grown silent around them, the buzz of activity outside their office barely reaching their ears. It was as if the entire department was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Harris didn't have to say anything. The tension in the air told Renee everything she needed to know. The search was on, but it was already becoming clear that Daniels was good at hiding. He had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew where he was. Every officer was on edge, their nerves frayed by the uncertainty of what would come next. Renee swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. How could he have done this? She couldn't understand it. She had believed in him, had thought of him as a partner. And now, here she was, left to pick up the pieces of everything he had shattered. It was a betrayal on a scale she couldn't even begin to comprehend. And it hurt, deeply. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing again. She looked down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat as she read the new message. This time, it was a location, a potential hideout. It was just a lead, but it was something. Renee's pulse quickened. There was a glimmer of hope now, a brief flicker of possibility. This was what she had trained for, what she had spent her entire career preparing for. But as she stood there, her eyes scanning the message, the fear returned. Daniels was out there. He was smart, and he had been planning this for a long time. The search was only just beginning, and it was a game of cat and mouse now. She didn't know how it would end, but she knew one thing for sure, nothing would ever be the same again. Daniels sat in the darkness of the room, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his chest. The only sound was the faint hum of the old ceiling fan, its tired blades barely stirring the thick, stale air. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and desperation, but beneath it all was something more, a cold, steely resolve. He had been cornered, exposed, hunted. The world had turned against him, and in the stillness of the moment, he could almost hear the faint echoes of his fall. He could feel his reputation, his power, slipping through his fingers like sand, and it was a feeling he could not, would not, accept. Betrayal was the word that consumed him. He had trusted Renee, had worked alongside her for years, believing that they were aligned in their vision, in their understanding of how the system worked. But she had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. She had shattered everything, not just by exposing him, but by making him seem like a monster in front of the entire world. The scorn in her eyes, the self-righteous anger, the way she had thrown him under the bus, it all gnawed at him. It wasn't just about losing his career or his reputation, it was about her turning her back on him when he needed her most. The same woman who had once been a trusted ally had become the reason he was now on the run. His eyes narrowed in the darkness as he thought about the people who had turned against him. It wasn't just Renee, it was the entire system, the people who had once been his colleagues, who had now made him their enemy. He had given them his loyalty, his years of service, and now they had abandoned him without a second thought. The thought of them made his blood boil, the rage burning in his veins like a wildfire. But what truly gnawed at him was the realization that the world saw him as the villain. They thought he was just a bad cop, a corrupt officer who had gotten what he deserved. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know what he had been trying to protect. But Daniels wasn't the type to give up. He had been underestimated for far too long, and now was the moment to show them just how wrong they were. His fingers twitched as his mind began to formulate a plan, as the fog of rage began to clear and he could see the next steps laid out before him. He would not let this be the end. He would not go down without a fight. And most importantly, he would not allow Renee to be the one to take him down. As the plan took shape in his mind, Daniels stood up, pacing the room with growing intensity. He needed to be calm, calculated. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control him, not when so much was at stake. The weight of the past few days had nearly crushed him, but now, in the quiet of his hiding place, he could finally think clearly. He could take control again. This was no longer about running or hiding, it was about retaliation. About making sure that the people who had wronged him paid the price. His gaze shifted toward the window, where the dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the room. The world had been looking for him, desperate to catch him, to throw him behind bars. But Daniels knew they were searching in the wrong places. They were chasing a shadow, an illusion. He had planned for this moment. Every move, every decision he had made in the past few weeks had been part of this game. He had covered his tracks, hidden his whereabouts, erased any trace of himself from their systems. He was untouchable, for now. But that wasn't enough. He couldn't just disappear into the night and wait for things to blow over. He was more than a fugitive now. He was a man with a purpose, a man who had been wronged and was determined to make those responsible suffer. Renee thought she had one. She thought she had exposed him for the world to see, but Daniels knew better. He wasn't done yet. And when the time came, she would regret ever crossing him. The thought of Renee, of her smug face and her righteous anger, pushed him further into the depths of his fury. He could almost hear her voice, the way she had tried to lecture him about the law, about what was right and wrong. It made his skin crawl. He had always known the world was full of hypocrisy, full of people who pretended to have all the answers while hiding their own secrets. And Renee, with her moral superiority, had been the perfect target. He had trusted her, let his guard down, and she had betrayed him in the most public way possible. But now, Daniels saw the bigger picture. He was no longer just a disgraced officer, he was a man on the edge, and the world would soon see just how far he was willing to go for revenge. With a sense of grim satisfaction, he knew that the game had only just begun. He had allies in places that no one could have imagined, people who owed him favors, people who had their own secrets to protect. He wasn't alone in this fight. He would reach out to those he trusted, people who had been waiting for the right moment to act. And together, they would bring the system to its knees. Renee thought she had taken everything from him, but she had only set the stage for his rise. The fall had been hard, but Daniels was no stranger to hardship. He had faced adversity before, and he had always come out on top. This time would be no different. As he thought about the revenge that was soon to come, he felt a chill run through him, not of fear, but of anticipation. The world would remember his name, but not as they thought. They would know Daniels as a man who had been pushed too far, a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The fall had been painful, but the rise would be unstoppable. The first move had been made, and there was no turning back now. The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the city in a cold, suffocating darkness. The narrow alley, dimly lit by flickering streetlights, was silent except for the steady rhythm of water dripping from rusted fire escapes. Renee stood at one end, her heart pounding, yet her hands remained steady. Across from her, Daniels lurked in the shadows, his face partially obscured by the mist. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now burned with a mixture of fury, desperation, and something far more dangerous, unhinged determination. "Is this really how you want it to end, Daniels?" Renee's voice cut through the night, unwavering despite the tension that crackled between them. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her gun, though she hadn't raised it, yet. Daniels let out a bitter chuckle, the sound hollow, almost broken. "And," he echoed, stepping forward, the dim light illuminating his gaunt face. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his frame, but he didn't seem to notice. His entire body was rigid, coiled like a predator ready to strike. "This doesn't end, Renee. Not for me. Not for you." Renee didn't move, didn't blink. She had spent too much time hunting him, unraveling his crimes, and watching his descent into madness. She knew there was no reasoning with him anymore. "It's over," she stated, firm, resolute. "You're out of options. Surrender now, and you might still have a chance." Daniel's lips curled into a snarl. "A chance?" He spat the word like poison. "You think there's anything left for me? I lost my badge, my reputation, my entire damn life. You took everything from me." His voice cracked with something dangerously close to grief, but he swallowed it down, replacing it with rage. "And now you expect me to just hand myself over? No. No, Renee. That's not how this works." He lifted his gun, his fingers twitching against the trigger. His hands weren't steady anymore. He was unraveling, barely holding himself together. His breath came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. He had been running for too long, hiding like a wounded animal. And now, cornered, he had nothing left to lose. "You used to have my back," he growled, his voice laced with betrayal. "You used to understand me. But instead of standing with me, you turned me into the villain." Renee's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, pity. "You did that yourself, Daniels," she said quietly. "I didn't make you into a monster. You chose this. You hurt innocent people. You abused your power. I gave you chances to stop, but you kept going." Daniels let out a shaky breath, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. His fingers flexed against the grip of his weapon, his mind at war with itself. Somewhere deep inside, he knew she was right. But admitting that? Accepting it? Impossible. The rain intensified, drumming against the pavement like a war drum. A long silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, Daniels lunged. His gun rose, his eyes blazing with reckless determination. A single gunshot shattered the night. Daniels jerked violently, his breath hitching as pain exploded in his chest. His weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering against the wet ground. For a moment, he swayed, blinking in disbelief. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. His legs buckled, and he collapsed, the cold pavement rushing up to meet him. Renee stood still, her gun still raised, smoke curling from its barrel. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to breathe, to steady herself. Slowly, she stepped forward, watching as Daniels struggled to lift his head. His breaths were shallow, uneven. His eyes found hers, and for the first time, the rage was gone. There was nothing left but exhaustion. Regret. "You never gave up," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. A bitter smile ghosted his lips. "Should have known." Renee didn't respond. She just watched as his body went still, the rain washing away the last traces of his fight. With a slow, measured breath, she lowered her gun. The night felt heavier now, the weight of everything sinking into her bones. It was over. Finally over. Turning away, she stepped back into the darkness, leaving the past behind her, drowned in the rain, just like Daniels.